For more than a century, we were told the story of the Titanic wrong because the Titanic did not sink. Only because it hit an iceberg, it could also have sunk because it tried to avoid it. An officer saw a shadow in the darkness, had 37 seconds to decide, and that decision changed history forever. The most unsettling thing is not only what happened that night, but that some engineers already suspected the truth in 1912. And more than a century later, modern digital reconstructions pushed that same idea again. Perhaps the frontal hit was not the worst scenario. If that is true, then the most famous tragedy in the world was not just a natural accident. It was a catastrophe caused by a human decision, logical, reasonable, and possibly fatal. The night of April 14, 1912, the Titanic was moving through the North Atlantic at high speed. The sky was clear. There was no moon, and the sea was so quiet that it looked like a black sheet of glass. That detail was more dangerous than it seems, because if there were no waves breaking against the base of the icebergs were much harder to detect in the crow's nest about 30 meters above the deck. The lookouts scanned the darkness with their sight. They had no binoculars, only their eyes, the freezing air hitting their faces, and a total blackness ahead of the ship. At 11:39 at night, Frederick Fleet saw something that should not have been there. It was not a clear image. It was not a white block shining in the distance. It was a huge dark mass appearing suddenly in front of them. Fleet reacted instantly. He rang the warning bell 3 times and called the bridge by phone. The message was direct, short, and terrifying: iceberg right ahead. On the bridge, First Officer William Murdoch received that warning and had barely seconds to act. Murdoch was not an improvised man. He was not a novice officer entering into a panic. He was an experienced sailor respected within the White Star Line, and he knew perfectly well the risks of the North Atlantic. What he did was in principle what any trained officer would have tried to do. He ordered to turn to avoid the obstacle and try to reduce the impact to the maximum. The problem was that on a ship like the Titanic, avoiding was not as simple as moving the rudder and waiting for a miracle. The Titanic was a gigantic machine, heavy, long, and it needed time and mechanical response to turn effectively. That time was not there between the warning and the contact. There were approximately 37 seconds. 37 seconds to see the danger, react, move a ship of that size, and twist the destiny of more than 2,000 people on board. The Titanic began to respond, but not fast enough. And instead of a brutal and concentrated frontal crash, something much more silent and much more lethal happened. The ship grazed the iceberg along the starboard side below the waterline. Many passengers barely felt anything. Some remembered a slight vibration, a strange tremor, as if the hull had passed over something minor. There was no explosion. There was no cinematic impact throwing people down the hallways, and precisely because of that, for a few minutes, almost nobody understood the gravity of what had just happened. But below the water in the front part of the ship, the sentence had already begun. The damage was not a gigantic rip open from end to end as popular culture imagined for decades. And most modern evidence points to something different, and in a way more disturbing. Small openings, deformations, and failures distributed at different points of the hull were enough to let the water in a monstrous wound. It was not needed to kill the Titanic. It was enough for the water to enter more compartments than the ship could support. And there is the key to this whole story. The Titanic was designed to stay afloat, even with several compartments flooded, but not with too many at the same time. If the damage remained concentrated at the front, the ship still had a chance to survive. If the damage was spread laterally along several sectors, the situation changed completely. That was exactly what made the Evasion maneuver so dangerous. Instead of concentrating the violence of the crash in a single area, it turned the impact into a series of distributed damages, meaning trying to save the bow could have doomed the rest of the hull. And that idea was not born just now. Weeks after the disaster, during the official British investigation of 1912, a fundamental testimony appeared. Edward Wilding, naval engineer from Harland and Wolff, the shipyard that had built the Titanic, explained something devastating. According to his analysis, if the ship had hit the iceberg head-on, probably only the front compartments would have flooded. The Titanic would have been seriously damaged, yes, but not necessarily condemned to sink the way it sank. In other words, the frontal crash could be terrible, but perhaps not mortal for the whole ship. The turning maneuver instead spread the disaster. That detail completely changes the way we usually imagine the tragedy, because the classic narrative is simple. The iceberg appeared, they hit it, and the Titanic sank. But the technical reality seems much more cruel. It was not just seeing the iceberg, it was seeing it late, reacting as any responsible officer would react, and having that response turn out worse. That makes the story much more uncomfortable, because then there is no longer a perfect and simple villain. It is not enough to say that everything was the fault of the ice of the night or of bad luck. The tragedy becomes human. It becomes the story of a man trying to do the right thing under extreme pressure, with seconds of margin and without any real possibility of checking the result. And the more you think about that, the more disturbing it becomes, because almost any of us put on that bridge would have wanted to avoid the impact. We would have turned. We would have tried to save the ship in exactly the same way. And maybe that same thing was what doomed it for decades. The popular myth preferred simpler images and easier to remember: the great unsinkable ocean liner, the killer iceberg, the inevitable crash, the fall of human pride in front of nature, all that remains part of the story. But it is not enough to explain why the Titanic was wounded in the exact way that made it impossible to save. Modern reconstructions and studies did something that for a long time could not be done. They allowed looking at the shipwreck with a much higher level of technical detail. And although they do not turn every point into absolute certainty, they did reinforce an unsettling conclusion. The damage does not seem to tell the story of a gigantic, clean opening. It tells the story of a series of small but distributed failures, exactly the type of damage that makes a prolonged lateral graze lethal. That means that the famous scene of the Titanic trying to avoid the iceberg maybe was not the beginning of its salvation. It was the beginning of its death. And the most tragic thing is that Murdoch probably never knew that he did not live to give his full version of what happened. He could not sit before history and explain what he saw, what he felt, or what he thought in those last minutes. The only thing left was the consequence of his decision. And that consequence was enough to haunt his name for more than a century. However, judging him comfortably from the present would be too easy. Murdoch did not act with malice. He did not act out of obvious negligence or caprice. He acted as an officer faced suddenly with a mass of ice appearing in the darkness would act. He acted under the logic of duty. He acted like a human being who believed that he was still in time to avoid the worst. And that is perhaps the most tragic part of the whole story of the Titanic. Not that someone did something monstrously stupid, but that someone did something reasonable and yet ended up causing a catastrophe. That is why this story continues to fascinate so much more than a century later, because it does not talk only about ship steel or naval engineering. It talks about the human limit against time. It talks about what happens when a right decision in theory becomes fatal in practice. It talks about the exact instant when there are no longer good options, only different damages. If the Titanic had hit head-on, maybe today we would remember it as a serious accident and not as the legendary tragedy. You know, perhaps there would have been injured, perhaps even dead. But the historical dimension of the disaster could have been completely different. Not the most famous sinking on the planet, not the eternal symbol of luxury, arrogance, and catastrophe. Not the story that we keep telling more than 100 years later. Everything could depend on a few seconds. 37, according to the most repeat. Reconstruction: 37 seconds between seeing the shadow reacting and sealing the destiny of the ship. That is what makes this story so powerful. Not only that the Titanic sank, but that maybe it sank because of the desperate attempt not to sink. And if that is true, then the Titanic was not destroyed solely by the iceberg. It was destroyed by one of the most human decisions in all maritime history. Trying to avoid the danger, trying to save everyone, trying to win a few more seconds against the impossible, and losing everything in the attempt. I am Nicholas, and this was the story of the decision that could have doomed the Titanic. And now tell me in the comments, if you had been on that bridge and had only 37 seconds, would you have turned or would you have crashed head on?